So welcome back to the Cape Cod Maritime Museum. Again, I'm Mary Everett-Patriquin, the museum's public programs coordinator, and we're very happy to have you join us again for a little more discussion about Scrimshaw. So again, I'm sitting here in front of the collection from Elizabeth H. and William Graham, a lovely collection of Scrimshaw items. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about the two general types of Scrimshaw items, those that are functional or that served some practical purpose, and the decorative. So to begin with functional items, sailors would commonly have made all sorts of objects that they needed aboard the ship out of Scrimshaw. So for example, we have a number of blocks. This would be part of a block and tackle or pulley system. These would be used to move items around the ship, hoist sails and whatnot. And they really range in size depending on the size of the rope and how many ropes you needed to get the job done. So we have a lovely small single block, rather diminutive, and a larger double block. This would have had two pieces of rope going through it. These go all the way up to triple blocks, some of which are quite large. So that would have been a very common item that folks would have made out of Scrimshaw if the ones they set off to sea with were to fail in some way. They also made things like whistles. This might be important for relaying signals among the crew. We find that there are a lot of tool handles made out of Scrimshaw. So one imagines probably that those might have been wooden handles initially, but of course with the exposure to ocean water and salty air, that those might deteriorate and might need to be replaced, and of course Scrimshaw was a perfect medium for doing that. So we see lots of tool handles made out of Scrimshaw. In addition to practical items that sailors could use aboard the ship, they also made things to entertain themselves. So for example, we have dominoes, that's a very common item, dice, and also cribbage sets. So cribbage boards really run the gamut from very small and basic to large and extremely ornate, and kind of everything in the middle. We are lucky to have this lovely cribbage board, which is made from a walrus tusk. This is a bit of a difficult object to photograph because it's so long. This is probably 2 to 2.5 feet long. If you look at it carefully, on either side of the tusk, you'll see little carved seals. And on one side, they're carved in the round. So you see the rounded shape of the seal's body. On the other side, they're flat. And that's because when you weren't playing cribbage with this piece, you could tip it up and display it because it really is a handsome piece. Down the middle of this cribbage board, you have a whole series of walrus heads with their tusks. They start off large and they get ever more diminutive as you reach the point of the tusk. So that's a really handsome object. It's possible that this might have been made by a native person, an Inuit, in Greenland or Canada or Alaska. We do know that New England whalers did go up to Greenland, and towards the end of the whaling industry, once the population of whales in the Atlantic had become severely reduced, New England whalers did go all the way down past the tip of South America and up into the Pacific Northwest to hunt whales. So in either of those northern extremes, it's possible that they came into contact with Inuit people who might have carved this piece and for whom a whaler might have traded something. So it's also possible that this could have been made by an American whaleman. We simply don't have a real way of knowing. The other category of, or subdivision sort of functional scrimshaw is items that sailors made for women back home. So whether that was your mother, grandmother, wife, sweetheart, sister, whoever, and these objects generally have to do with either cooking or sewing. So you'll see a great number of spoons, forks, egg cups. You'll see things like knitting needles, crochet hooks. We have a lovely one here. You can see there's some sort of pretty faceted cuts made on the crochet hook. This one ends with a lovely hand with a finger pointing. Another example with a lovely design made of carved circles. This one is actually a letter opener. I don't know if you can see it in this photo, but there's a closed fist at the top, and in the middle of it there's carved a beautiful spiral that goes all the way around. And we have a whole extensive category of objects known as pie crimpers. So a pie crimper was simply a wheel, sometimes referred to as a jagging wheel, with a handle attached to it. So you would take that and run it around the edge of your pie crust, and that would help to seal the crust and make a decorative edge. Some of them also had a fork attached that would allow you to prick the top of the pie to let the steam escape. So, and these ran the gamut from, again, pretty rudimentary and basic to incredibly ornate. We get very elaborate animal forms and flower forms. They're just, some people took this simple form and really, really elevated it to the nth degree. Most of ours here kind of fall into the middle category. So we have a fairly simple one that has a heart carved into the handle, and then just a few kind of half moons and sort of scallop shapes carved out of it, a little bit of sort of fluted shapes that went around the handle. Another one that has two hearts carved into it. Another which is more elaborate with the jagging wheel. The jagging wheel would be joined to the handle with a metal rivet in the center, and sometimes there is an attempt to use that rivet as an eye and to carve part of the wheel to look like an animal's head, usually a bird of some type. So we have that. At the opposite end, a circle, but not one that moves. This one would have been used as a decorative stamp. So if you were making cookies, for example, you might use that to stamp your cookie and give it a little bit more of a decorative look. In between these two ends, we have a somewhat elaborate handle. In the very center, you'll see a dark piece. We believe that that's a piece of baleen. And when we looked at this very closely, we realized that the two halves of the handle are actually pinned into that piece of baleen. This might have been done simply as part of the design, or it's also possible it might have been a repair that might originally all have been one long piece that broke in the center and had to be repaired. The third possibility is that the person making this wanted to make something of a certain length but only had two shorter pieces of bone or tooth to work with. So in that case, you could make two halves of the handle and then pin them together. You'll notice that at each end of the handle, there are 4 slim column shapes at each corner of the handle. And at first we weren't sure whether these pieces were pinned into the handle, made separately and then pinned in, or whether in fact they had been carved very carefully from a single piece of ivory. And it turns out in fact that it is the latter. That was a solid piece of ivory, and someone took the time and a lot of effort and skill to carve away, leaving just those 4 slender columns on each side. So that's an especially lovely piece. Another very common item of functional scrimshaw were busks. A busk was a length of stiff material, usually 2 or perhaps 2.5 inches wide, that would go into a lady's corset, and that would be the part that would keep you from being able to bend. I could not understand why someone would want to give their sweetheart something that essentially was going to be digging into their ribs all day, but there actually is a reason for it. Very often busks will be carved with a heart image somewhere on them, and the idea was that if your sweetheart wore that in her corset, then the heart you carved would lie close to her heart. So there really is sort of a lovely reason for that. Again, decoration on busks could range from very, very simple. So we have an example here with a kind of curved geometric design. This would most likely have been done with a compass. That's compass, the thing that lets you draw a circle, not compass like finding your direction compass. So it's a simple design repeated of kind of curving and intersecting lines. We have other examples in our collection that are very ornate. And there was a whole series of kind of categories of motifs you might use. So there were lots of foliage motifs. There were garlands and vines, wreaths, depictions of trees or plants in potters. There were there were certainly heart symbols. Again, that was a very common one. There were stars. There were compass roses. All sorts of things. And you wonder if maybe there might have been some one-upsmanship going on to figure out who could use the most sophisticated and the largest number of different motifs on their busk. So we have one example in our collection which is very interesting because it contains 4 symbols kind of joined together in a larger circle that look like a Chinese yin-yang symbol. So it's certainly possible that men aboard American whaling vessels might have at some point met up with Chinese sailors, perhaps in the Pacific Northwest, or that design might have been passed from Asia to some part of Europe, then to North America. So it was possible for motifs to sort of work their way around the world. We also have a lovely polychrome example in our busk collection. So again, polychrome simply means there's more than one color, and this one happens to be worked in black and brown. Here we see 2 hearts entwined, so lovely. This beautiful star shape, and further up, this is a little bit harder to see, but there is an eagle with its wings outstretched, holding an olive branch and a flight of arrows, and over it a banner that reads truth. So those are a few examples from our collection, but again, there were many, many of these made with a whole plethora of different design motifs. that leads us to the next category of scrimshaw, which are the pieces that were designed mainly to be decorative. And these used a whole variety of motifs. Once again, we see probably the most common of which were ones having to do with sailing in whales. So there are many, many depictions of whaling ships. And here, once again, you can see that some men had more artistic training or sophistication than other people. Some folks would actually use images from magazines to make a template for their artwork. So we have this example from our collection. This would sort of work in two ways. You'd take the image from the magazine, you would lay it over the tooth, and then you would prick it with an awl or some other sharp, pointy device, and you'd make a series of pinpricks along the major shapes in the image. And then, of course, when you took the paper away, you'd have that little pinprick outline on your tooth. They could also be made by pricking the magazine image separately, then laying that over the tooth and rubbing it with, again, soot or some other kind of dye. And when you took the paper away, you would clearly see a nice dotted outline. So you see this in this particular tooth from our collection. Here those dots are fairly prominent, and this might either have been someone who felt a little unsure of themselves and wanted to make it clear where the design was going. Or it's possible, I suppose, that it might have been an image from a magazine that was reused a number of times. That a number of men might have said, "Ooh, I like the look of that ship. I want to put that on my tooth." And then it was passed around a number of times, and during that, some of those holes got to be a little bit bigger. So that's kind of a lovely insight. We have another lovely example with a sailing ship, very finely detailed. The rigging is beautifully detailed in this particular depiction. Towards the stern, that is the rear of the ship, we see this row of little white squares, and those were actually the windows of the captain's quarters in the stern of the ship. And across the middle, we see this enormous wave flowing over the deck. So a really particularly nicely detailed piece. Here's another ship image. This one at the top of the mast has a couple of flags. These are fairly simple. One of them has a star and the other one doesn't appear to be decorated in any way. But it's not unusual in Scrimshaw for there to be the flag of the country clearly depicted. So this is an American ship or this is a British ship. Another ship, and when we turn this tooth over, something else on the back. This was quite common that you could decorate both sides of the tooth. Not all teeth are decorated on both sides, but it's quite common. So in this one, we see a gentleman in what looks like a formal dress uniform, military dress probably. He's wearing epaulets. He has a tall hat with a feather in it. He's holding something next to his side, which we think is probably a matchlock rifle. So you can see some of those lovely details. In the hand opposite, the one that's holding the gun, he's holding what appears to be perhaps a scroll or a rolled document of some kind. So there we have the ship on one side and perhaps one of the sailors, or most likely officers, that served aboard that ship. As you can imagine, patriotic symbols were very popular. So this lovely tooth has on the front side Lady Liberty. So she's wearing sort of a flowing dress. We see decoration around the hem of her dress. Perhaps that's meant to depict lace or embroidery of some kind. There's some suggestion that there might be a cape over her shoulders. She's wearing a banner across her torso that reads Independence. And she's holding a flag that's kind of a pennant shape, but looks very much like an American flag in particular. Down at her feet on one side, we see a cannon. And if we look at the close-up of that, you can tell that it's a cannon, but it's been drawn by someone who doesn't really have any background in three-dimensional perspective. And this is quite common, that we'll see scenes where a building is being depicted or some other kind of three-dimensional object, and it's handled a little bit oddly, but you can still tell that it's a cannon and that was something specific that person wanted to include with the image of Lady Liberty. At the very bottom, at her feet, is inscribed W. Lawrence. We have no idea who W. Lawrence was, possibly William Lawrence, and our initial research has led us to the fact that there were many, many William Lawrences in 19th century New England. I'm not sure if we're ever going to figure out that mystery, but it's one that would be a lot of fun to kind of chase a bit and see where we might get. So, and if we turn this tooth over, we see a depiction of kind of a dapper country gentleman, perhaps. He's wearing a long sort of frock coat, a tall hat with an upturned brim. He's carrying a rifle, and it's hard to tell from this photograph, but he actually has two dogs seated next to his feet. Above him is something that maybe looks like some type of family crest. There's sort of an oval shape, and leaning up against that oval there's a dog on each side standing on its hind legs. And at the very top, there's a buck with a full rack of antlers. So maybe this was some way of marking a family that was particularly interested in hunting. So, and that side of the tooth is engraved with the initials WBL. So at least W. Lawrence, we know that his middle initial was P. So, but that's really a lovely tooth as well. Another patriotic subject, of course, was the American eagle. So here we see a lovely tooth with a finely detailed eagle, his feathers drawn clearly, a lot of attention paid to the texture in his talons. He's in fact standing on an anchor, and you sort of see part of the rope kind of trailing along the outer edge of the piece of Scrimshaw. In one talon he holds the olive branch again, and the other the flight of arrows. His beak is open, and you can see how the beak is quite sharp. And of course that kind of steely eye. So this is a very kind of ferocious depiction of freedom and liberty. Another very common category of purely decorative images on Scrimshaw, of course, are lovely ladies. These are men who would be spending years away at sea with nary a woman in sight. These are quite common images. Here's a lovely example from our collection. This is a polychrome piece, which is sort of done in browns and sort of a yellowish color. So we see a woman in a bonnet in a very elaborate dress. The dress is covered with what might be lace or embroidery or perhaps ribbon work. And if you look at this close-up, you'll see that once again, it's really made up of just a series of small straight lines. There are curved lines here and there, but for the most part, everything is detailed using simply small straight lines. But again, a beautiful detailed depiction of this dress. Here we believe that she's supposed to be depicted here wearing gloves. And the detail on the face and the head is lovely. You can see her bonnet strings tied under her chin, and this lovely coiffed black hairdo. So a lovely piece, and someone, again, that took a great amount of care in depicting her dress in great detail. So that's really a lovely piece. Here we have a pair of teeth. These were probably meant to be used as bookends. Again, and this is polychrome. So we do see reddish tones, brown tones here, brown, and of course black. So in one of these, we see a woman with some type of flowing headdress and a flowing gown. She has a long, dark braid, and she's holding a ewer. And on the other tooth, a woman with a long blue sort of headscarf. And we believe seated next to her, this is a little bit hard to see, but seated next to her, another woman who's sort of leaning against her. Maybe this is meant to be a mother and child depiction, something like that. So, but they're very clearly women from some other culture, from some other part of the world. Now, when we turn these around, what do you have on the back? You have two lovely New England maidens. So once again, a lot of care has been taken to depict their elaborate detailed dresses. One of them is shown with her bonnet strings sort of flying. The other one is holding a flower, perhaps a tulip. This type of two-sided depiction is not uncommon, to have a lovely staid New England maiden on one side and a more exotic woman from a different culture on the other side. And there are at least a few of these which are known to be inscribed with the phrase, "To our wives and sweethearts, may they never meet." So once again, you see kind of a real range of skill level. Another item that I find really interesting in this collection is one that uses a very, very simple motif, and that is a circle with a dot in the center. So in art history, you call that a pileated dot, but again, it's simply a circle or a half circle with a dot in the center. So someone has taken that single motif and has used it in an interesting sort of curving layout that sort of goes over the curve of the tooth itself. So this simple design is placed on the tooth with a real sense of the three-dimensional effect that it would have. And even though the design is very simple, I think this is really a lovely way to use it on a three-dimensional object. So if my sweetheart had been off to sea for 3 or 4 years and brought this back to me, I think I'd be quite smitten with that. There is a possibility here, once again, that this tooth might have been decorated by a native person, an Inuit person, again from Greenland, Canada, or northern Alaska. Pileated dots are a very, very common design motif among Inuit peoples, and they're used on all kinds of objects, from clothing to wooden objects, everything in between. So there's some possibility that this might have been made by an Inuit person. So, but it could also be a sailor who saw this motif somewhere. Again, we know these motifs really did kind of move around the world. So maybe they saw that and they thought, well, my artistic skills aren't that great, but I could certainly make a series of circles with dots in the middle. And again, I think that this is really a charming piece. And there you have it, some of really the best pieces from our Scrimshaw collection here at the Cape Cod Maritime Museum. We hope you can come down sometime and see these pieces in person.